come closer. Pull your chair in just a little. I want to show you a book that very nearly made it into your Bible. Not a fringe text, not something scribbled on the margins of early Christianity. A book that was read aloud in churches, that serious bishops defended as scripture, that appeared right alongside Matthew and Paul in some of the most important canon lists of the ancient world. And then it didn't make it. Not banned with fury, not burned, set aside, quietly, over the course of a few generations, the way a congregation sometimes stops singing an old hymn and eventually no longer remembers quite why. The book is The Apocalypse of Peter. Now, when I say apocalypse, I don't want you to picture fire and horsemen right away. In Greek, apocalypse simply means an unveiling, a pulling back of the curtain to see what lies on the other side. That's exactly what this text promises. It claims to be a vision given to the Apostle Peter by the risen Jesus himself, a guided tour of heaven and hell given to one of the 12 on the Mount of Olives, shortly before the Passion. Here is the detail that stopped me cold the first time I encountered it. For a stretch of the 2nd century, this text was considered so authoritative that Clement of Alexandria, one of the most learned Christian scholars of his age, wrote a commentary on it. A commentary, the kind of sustained, careful attention you only give to something you believe carries real weight. And I'll tell you something else. We have a fragment of this text that was buried with a Christian monk in Egypt, not stored in a library, buried. The way you bury something precious, something you want to take with you. That's what we're going to look at tonight. Where this book came from, who set it aside and why, and what it actually says, because what it says will stay with you. I want to say something before we go any further, because I've found over the years that it matters. I've been in ministry for 50 years. I've sat with people in their last hours, stood at gravesides in January, and baptized the grandchildren of people I buried. I am not a professor with a theory. I am a pastor who kept running into books his congregation had never heard of, books that the early church was wrestling with, debating, treasuring, and eventually setting aside. I started collecting them to understand my own faith better. I never stopped. So when I tell you about a text like this, I want you to know exactly what kind of ground we're standing on at every step. Some of what I'll tell you is documented history manuscripts you can look up, councils whose decisions were written down, scholars whose names and dates are on record. Some of it is tradition, things passed down without an early document to verify them, and some of it is interpretation, what I think, what others have argued, what the text might mean. I will tell you which is which. That's the only honest way to do this. Let's begin with the book itself. What is it, and where did it come from? The Apocalypse of Peter is a Christian text written in Greek that presents itself as a revelation given to the Apostle Peter by Jesus. In its fullest surviving form, it opens on the Mount of Olives. The disciples have gathered around Jesus, and Peter asks him about the last things, the final judgment, what becomes of the dead, what the end of the world will look like. And Jesus answers at extraordinary length with imagery that is vivid and often startling. Now, I have to be honest with you about authorship, because honesty here is everything. The text claims Peter as its source. Virtually no modern scholar believes the Apostle Peter wrote it. The scholarly consensus, and I don't use that word lightly, places its composition in the early to middle 2nd century, most likely between roughly 100 and 150 AD. The Apostle Peter died, according to tradition, in Rome around 64 or 68 AD, during the persecution under Nero. That's a gap of at least a generation, more likely two. What we have, in all likelihood, is a Christian community in the 2nd century writing a text in Peter's name to give it authority, a practice that was common in the ancient world and that early Christians called pseudepigraphy, writing under an honored name to carry forward what the community believed that person would have said. It doesn't make the text worthless. It makes it a window into what early Christians believed, hoped, and feared, but I won't pretend it was written by the fisherman from Galilee, because there's no honest reason to think it was. What we do know is that it circulated widely and early. The Muratorian Fragment, a Latin document that most scholars date to the late 2nd century, and which is among our earliest surviving attempts to list the books Christians considered authoritative, includes the Apocalypse of Peter, right there on the list. Though even that early document adds a careful qualification I'll come back to in a moment. Now, the manuscripts. We have two primary surviving versions of this text, and they differ in significant ways, which tells you something about how a living text moves through communities and gets adapted. The first major discovery came in 1886 in Akhmim in Upper Egypt. A Greek fragment was found in the tomb of a monk, buried with him. That detail has never left me. Someone loved this text enough, or trusted it enough, or feared to leave it behind, that it went into the ground with them. This Akhmim fragment, as scholars call it, gives us the most vivid version of the text's descriptions of the afterlife. The second version came to light through the discovery of manuscripts at the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai, the same remarkable library that gave us so much of ancient Christianity's written inheritance, through a related Ethiopic translation that preserves what many scholars believe is a text closer to an earlier form of the Apocalypse. The Ethiopic version in particular differs from the Akhmim fragment in interesting ways, including its treatment of the fate of the damned at the very end of the text. So we have a real ancient manuscript-supported document, late 2nd century, not from Peter, but genuinely old, genuinely read, genuinely wrestled with. Let's hold that clearly before we move on. Why wasn't it included? That's the question that pulls people in, and it deserves a careful answer. Start with the Muratorian Fragment again. That early canon list does include the Apocalypse of Peter, but it adds something telling. It notes that some people in the church do not want it read publicly in church services. Even at the moment of its recognition, there was hesitation, not outright rejection, hesitation, the kind that hardens over time. By the late 2nd and early 3rd century, the Christian world was actively trying to sort out which text carried real apostolic authority and which did not. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing his ecclesiastical history in the early 4th century, is one of our most important guides to this process. Eusebius was careful and methodical. He divided texts into 3 rough categories: those universally acknowledged, those disputed, and those he considered spurious. The Apocalypse of Peter lands in his disputed or doubtful category. He acknowledges it exists, he knows it has supporters, but he is clearly not persuaded that it belongs among the acknowledged books. The reasons were several, and they overlapped. First, authorship. The more the church thought carefully about which text could be traced credibly to the apostles or their immediate circle, the more the Apocalypse of Peter struggled. Its 2nd century origin was apparent to perceptive readers, and a text that presents itself as coming from Peter but almost certainly doesn't is exactly the kind of thing that made careful bishops nervous. Second, the question of universal reception. One of the criteria early church leaders returned to again and again was this: is this text accepted everywhere, across all the major churches? The Apocalypse of Peter was accepted in some places, doubted in others, and by the time of Eusebius, it had clearly not achieved the kind of broad, settled recognition that Matthew or Paul's letters had. Third, and this is worth sitting with, the content itself raised questions. The Apocalypse of Peter is, at its heart, a text about judgment and the afterlife. Its descriptions of hell are among the most graphic anywhere in early Christian literature. That's not automatically a problem. Revelation is vivid too. But the specific character of its visions and the very particular theology embedded in some versions of the text put it in territory some leaders found difficult. And then there is Clement of Alexandria's commentary. You might think, here is a great scholar endorsing the text. Surely that helped it survive. But Clement was, even in his own lifetime, considered by some to be too adventurous in his thinking. His willingness to blend Christian faith with Greek philosophy made him admired in some circles and viewed with caution in others. His endorsement of the Apocalypse of Peter did not settle the question. If anything, it may have complicated the text's reputation in more conservative communities. By the time Athanasius of Alexandria issued his famous Festal Letter in 367 AD, the letter that listed, for the first time in documented history, exactly the 27 books that now make up our New Testament, the Apocalypse of Peter, was not on it. Not condemned, not denounced, simply absent. The door had closed, quietly, as doors do. So what does it actually say? This is the part I want you to stay with me for, because the content of this text is extraordinary. And I mean that in the precise sense. It goes beyond the ordinary, into territory that the imagination of the early church found both irresistible and unsettling. The text opens, as I said, on the Mount of Olives. The disciples are with Jesus. Peter asks about the signs of the end and about judgment. What follows is a teaching partly familiar, partly arresting, that moves through two great landscapes, heaven and hell. The vision of heaven, in both surviving versions, is luminous. There are figures of radiant light, a beauty that surpasses description, a sense of peace that the text strains to put into words. Two men appear, dazzling white, in a scene that clearly echoes the Transfiguration. The righteous are gathered there, in a garden of blossoming flowers and fragrance, in bodies of light. This part of the Apocalypse draws on imagery you'd recognize from other early Christian writing: brightness, peace, the restoration of the body. But it is the other landscape that has made the Apocalypse of Peter famous. The descriptions of hell, of the place of punishment, are specific, elaborate, and organized by sin. Each category of wrongdoing has its corresponding torment, matched with a kind of terrible symmetry. Those who blasphemed the way of righteousness hang by their tongues over flame. Women who braided their hair to entice men to fornication hang by their hair over a boiling pit, while the men who went to them hang by another part of their bodies. Murderers are set in a place of great fire, their victims nearby watching. Those who lent money and demanded repayment with interest here, the Achmim text is very specific role in filth and mud. Now, I want to stop here and say something plainly, because I think honesty requires it. These images are not comfortable. They were not meant to be. The Apocalypse of Peter belongs to a genre of early Jewish and Christian writing about the afterlife, what scholars sometimes call apocalyptic literature. And in that genre, the specific punishments matched to specific sins served a purpose. They were a mirror held up to the community. They were meant to make people examine their lives. The text is not a courtroom document about who actually suffers what after death. It is a moral vision, a warning, a way of saying, the choices you make here echo, whether you read it as literal description or as metaphorical teaching. It raises the same question, and the early church felt this too. What is God actually like? Is this compatible with the mercy we see in the Gospels? That tension is at the heart of what made the Apocalypse of Peter both beloved and contested. And then there is the ending, or rather the two endings, because this is where the Achmim Greek fragment and the Ethiopic version part ways most dramatically, and where things become genuinely moving. In the Ethiopic version, something happens that is remarkable. After all the descriptions of punishment, after the terrifying catalogue of torments, there is a moment of mercy. Peter intercedes. He prays for the damned. And in the Ethiopic text, there is a suggestion carefully hedged, but present, that his intercession may be heard. that on the Lord's Day, the holy day, there may be relief, even restoration, for some of those being punished. This is not universalism in a formal theological sense. I want to be careful here and flag this as interpretation. What exactly the Ethiopic text means by this passage is debated among scholars, but the impulse behind it is unmistakable. It is Peter, the rock of the church, asking, "Is there mercy even here?" And the text, at least in this version, seems to suggest that the question deserves an answer. The Achmim fragment, by contrast, does not have this moment of intercession in the same way. The two surviving traditions of this one text are themselves in dialogue about one of the deepest questions a human being can ask. Is punishment final? Think about what that tells you about the people who preserved these texts. They were not theologians working out a systematic doctrine. They were human beings who had buried their children, who had watched friends die in persecution, who had carried the weight of their own sins for years, who wanted to know what God was going to do with all of that. They read this text in their communities. Some of them loved the sharp edges of the judgment sections because those edges said, God is not indifferent, the wicked do not simply get away with it. Others were drawn to the mercy at the end because they needed to believe the story was not over for anyone. This is the human argument inside the apocalypse of Peter. Not a theological dispute, a cry. You and I hold the same Bible every Sunday. It took centuries to assemble. Decisions were made, some by great councils, some by individual bishops writing letters, some by communities simply continuing to read certain texts until those texts became inescapable. The Apocalypse of Peter was read in those centuries. It shaped how early Christians imagined the world to come, and then the decisions accumulated over time left it out. Was that the right call? I'm not going to pretend I know. The church had real reasons: authorship, universal reception, the careful work of trying to identify which text genuinely carried the weight they claimed. Those are not trivial concerns. And I'll admit, sitting with the Apocalypse of Peter, for as long as I have, I understand both why it was so loved and why it made people nervous. What I do know is this: leaving it out did not make it disappear. A monk in Egypt carried it into the grave with him. Clement of Alexandria wrote a commentary on it. The Muratorian fragment listed it alongside texts that would become the New Testament. The text traveled across languages, from Greek to Ethiopic, carried by communities who found something in it they needed. That is not nothing. That is the fingerprint of something that mattered. I've spent decades collecting these texts, reading them, thinking about them, checking what scholars say against what the manuscripts actually tell us. And I've tried to be honest, not to sensationalize, not to claim more than the evidence carries, but also not to pretend these books don't exist or don't matter. Over the years, I've gathered everything I've learned into a collection source by source, with notes about what's certain and what isn't, what's documented record and what's later tradition. If you'd like something like that close at hand, I'll tell you where to find it before we're done. There's one more thing I want to leave with you, and it has nothing to do with manuscripts or canon lists. Peter was a man who failed at the worst possible moment. He stood in a courtyard on the coldest night of his life and said 3 times that he did not know Jesus. He wept bitterly afterward. And then we know this from the Gospels: he was restored. He was not abandoned. He was brought back. The community that wrote this apocalypse in Peter's name knew that story. They chose Peter, of all the apostles, to be the one who stands at the edge of heaven and looks into the place of suffering and asks, "Is there mercy here?" I don't think that's an accident. I think they chose him because of who he was, a man who knew what it meant to be in the outer darkness and what it meant to hear his name called back. Whether or not this text was written by Peter, whatever the 2nd century hand that set these words down, the question at its center is Peter's question: it is yours, it is mine. And I'll leave the answer where the text leaves it, open, in the hands of the one who calls names in the dark. Turn the lamp down when you've finished thinking it over, and come back whenever you like. The door stays open.